The journey. The longship was smaller than you expected, measuring perhaps 28 meters long and only 5 meters wide, which meant that 30 to 60 men would be crammed together for however long this voyage lasted. The shallow draft that made these ships so effective for surprise raids also meant they rode low in the water and offered almost no protection from wind, spray, and the constant motion that turned your stomach within hours of leaving port. You left in late spring or early summer when the sailing season opened, chosen by your chieftain from among the men in your community who were free, physically capable, and willing to risk their lives for whatever wealth this raid might bring. The decision to leave wasn't entirely your own because your family's economic situation, your reputation within the community, and the expectations placed on young men all combined to push you toward this moment. And now that the shore was gone, there was no turning back. The North Sea crossing from Norway to the British Isles or from Denmark to Francia could take several days depending on wind and weather, and during that time you ate dried fish, drank whatever water or weak ale you'd brought, and tried not to think about the fact that longships could sink and men could drown without anyone back home ever knowing what happened. Seasickness was common even among experienced raiders, and for first-time voyagers like yourself, the constant rolling motion combined with the smell of salt, sweat and fear created misery that lasted for days. Navigation relied on experienced helmsmen who used the sun's position during the day, the stars at night, and knowledge passed down through generations about currents, landmarks, and the appearance of waves to find their way across open water. You had no maps, no instruments beyond perhaps a simple sun compass, and no guarantee that you wouldn't end up lost or shipwrecked on some unknown coast, which meant that every moment of the journey depended entirely on the skill and memory of men who had made this crossing before. Approach to target, silence and waiting. The shore appears, but not with drums or battle cries, because Viking raid tactics depended entirely on surprise and the element of speed, which meant approaching your target in darkness or dawn's early light and maintaining absolute silence until the moment you landed. The final approach was controlled and deliberate, with the helmsman guiding the shallow draft longship directly onto the beach in a maneuver that required skill because you needed enough momentum to ground the vessel firmly, but not so much that you damage the hull or make it impossible to retreat quickly if things went wrong. You waited, crouched in the ship with your weapons ready, and your heart pounding so hard you could feel it in your throat, listening to the sound of oars sliding through water and the occasional quiet command from the chieftain or helmsman. This waiting was worse than the seasickness, because now there was nothing between you and violence except a few hundred meters of water and whatever seconds remained before the ship hit the beach and you had to leap over the side into unknown danger. Fear was not something you could show or even acknowledge because your culture had trained you since childhood to value fearlessness above almost everything else. But the men around you felt the same terror even if their faces showed nothing, and the silence during those final moments of approach contained more dread than any amount of screaming could have expressed. You had been told that your time of death was predetermined by fate and that nothing you did could change when the Norns would cut your thread, but this philosophical certainty offered cold comfort when your hands shook and your stomach churned, and you wondered whether this monastery or village would be the place where your predetermined death finally arrived. Before continue, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you enjoy videos like this, be sure to like the video and subscribe. The attack, violence and chaos. The ship grounds with a scraping sound that seems impossibly loud, and suddenly everything becomes movement and noise as men leap over the sides into shallow water, drag the longship higher onto the beach to prevent it floating away, and form up behind their shields while scanning the area for any signs of resistance or organized defense. The first moments after landing were the most vulnerable, because if defenders had spotted your approach and prepared an ambush, this was when they would strike. But monasteries and small coastal villages rarely had warning systems or armed guards, which is precisely why they made such attractive targets. You're moving now, shield in one hand and weapon in the other, feet carrying you forward, because stopping means getting left behind or showing cowardice, and neither is acceptable, even though your legs feel weak and your breath comes in gasps that have nothing to do with physical exertion. The target comes into view, whether it's a monastery with its church and outbuildings or a village with houses clustered near the shore, and the absence of organized resistance means your chieftain's intelligence was correct and you've achieved the surprise that made Viking raids so devastatingly effective. The violence, when it starts, is not organized or controlled, but rather a confused mass of individual encounters where you swing your weapon at anyone who resists, grab whatever valuables you can carry, and try not to get separated from your companions, because isolated raiders could be overwhelmed and killed. The monks or villagers who didn't flee are either cut down or captured, with young, healthy individuals being seized as potential slaves who could be sold for silver, while the elderly and infirm are often killed because they have no economic value and might slow down your retreat. The attack lasted perhaps an hour at most, because Viking tactics emphasized speed over thorough conquest, and staying too long meant risking the arrival of local armed forces who might trap your raiding party between the sea and an organized defense. You grabbed what you could, killed whoever resisted, dragged captured slaves back toward the ship, and tried to ignore the screaming that came from everywhere, because this was what raiding meant, and there was no room for mercy or hesitation when your survival depended on getting back to the longship before reinforcements arrived. Who didn't come back? The retreat was faster than the attack, because now you carried loot, pushed captives ahead of you, and knew that every moment spent on shore increased the danger that this raid would turn from success into disaster. Not everyone made it back to the ship, because some raiders went too far inland chasing plunder. Some were killed by defenders who fought back, and some simply vanished in the confusion and were never seen again, their fates unknown, and their families back home left to wonder whether they died bravely or were captured and enslaved themselves. The longship pushed off from the beach with fewer men than it arrived with, and the empty spaces in the rowing positions served as silent testimony to the cost of this raid, though whether you'd lost 3 men or 10 wouldn't be known until someone counted and discovered who was missing. Viking warfare expected casualties, and first raids especially saw losses because inexperienced raiders made mistakes, hesitated at critical moments, or simply encountered bad luck, and these deaths were accepted as the necessary price of wealth and reputation, even if they left families without fathers or sons. The return voyage felt different, because now the ship carried silver taken from churches, goods looted from villages, and captured slaves who would be sold at markets throughout Scandinavia, or kept as labourers by individual raiders, and this wealth represented the entire reason for the raid's existence, even if it came covered in blood and accompanied by the memory of violence that would never entirely leave your mind. You were no longer the person who left home weeks earlier, because you had now participated in killing, witnessed death up close, and crossed a threshold that separated those who had raided from those who had only trained, and this transformation was precisely what Viking culture valued, even if the reality was far grimmer than the sagas suggested. Your first Viking raid taught you that violence was messy and frightening rather than glorious, that killing was easier than you expected, but left you feeling emptier than the sagas had prepared you for, and that the wealth you brought home came at a cost that couldn't be measured in silver or slaves. The men who died during the raid weren't remembered as heroes, but rather as unfortunate casualties, whose families received a share of the plunder as compensation, and the slaves you captured would spend the rest of their lives in bondage because their only mistake was living in a place that Viking longships could reach. The psychological impact of your first raid would stay with you for the rest of your life because you had now seen what humans could do to other humans when survival and profit removed the normal restraints of society, and this knowledge changed how you viewed both yourself and the world around you. Future raids would be easier in some ways because the initial shock of violence had passed, but they would also confirm what you learned on this first expedition, which was that raiding was fundamentally about taking wealth by force from people who couldn't defend themselves effectively, regardless of what justifications or cultural values your society attached to the practice. Going on your first Viking raid was not the adventure promised by sagas and legends, but rather a terrifying experience that combined seasickness, fear, violence, confusion, and the realization that some of your companions wouldn't survive to see home again. The reality of Viking raids was that they succeeded through surprise attacks on undefended targets, achieved their economic goals through violence and enslavement, and left both raiders and victims changed in ways that glory and reputation couldn't compensate for. If this look into what actually happened during a Viking raid gave you a different perspective on Norse warriors, hit that like button and subscribe for more history that shows the reality behind the legends. Thanks for watching.